talk. We're really excited about it. For those of you who might be new to the Harris Center, especially in this Zoom environment where you can join us from all over, we are a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire, and our work is helping people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and education of all ages. So if you are local to us, you might like to know that we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that is open for hiking and other recreation. We coordinate conservation research on those protected lands and throughout the region through a variety of community science initiatives. And then really at the heart of everything we do, and something you can join us for, whether you're local or not, is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic for us has been this transition to Zoom talks, because we're really able to connect with people from much further afield. And we've got an incredible lineup of Zoom talks scheduled for the spring. So if you're new to us, I really encourage you to check us out at harriscenter.org. You can get information on hiking trails and upcoming events and community science projects. So this speaker series, we're really excited, is co-sponsored with the Harris Center and a number of wonderful local libraries, and we're highlighting a different one each week. So this week is the Keene Public Library. So Gail, would you like to say a few words about the Keene Library?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much. We really appreciate this opportunity to co-sponsor this series. And I'm actually really excited about the Abbott Thayer program. That's something I want to turn into. Sounds great. If you're interested in any of the programs that the library has, we have a lot of programs, and I would say some of the themes that we really try to concentrate a lot in our programs include STEM programming and programs related to social justice, and also programs related to community conversations. One program that we have tomorrow at about this time, it's at 1:00 in the afternoon. There it's a screening and a discussion of the film Tribal Justice, which deals with restorative justice in tribal communities with tribal judges. That is a really exciting program. We have a program like that once a month. I'm going to put in the chat, in case anybody is interested, the ways that you would connect with us at the library if you wanted to see the programs that we're offering, if you wanted to get an email of our events, or you wanted to connect with us on Facebook so you could see the programs that we're doing. So I'm really excited, and thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Gail, and all of our public libraries. We love you. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Kelly Louise. She's a PhD candidate in marine science and technology at UMASS-Boston, where her research focuses on using remote sensing technology to improve coastal water quality monitoring. As a Native Hawaiian researcher, she's committed to increasing access to environmental data for marginalized communities, and also to supporting Black, Indigenous, and people of color working in oceanography. So we're really excited to have her joining us from the Boston area to share with us about the urban ocean. So take it away, Kelly.
Well, I just want to first start off by saying thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this series. You've put together an incredible collection of speakers and partnerships to do this. So I'm really humbled to have this opportunity and to connect with all of you here today. So what I'm going to be talking about is the urban ocean and the view from Boston Harbor, which is really the development of a place-based first-year seminar that my university really gave me the support to develop, and it was intended to connect first-year students more deeply with the history, science, and culture of the Boston area. So today, what I'm going to talk about is what went into creating a place-based course. In addition, I'll kind of go and talk about how this fits in the larger field of place-based education, and talk about all the nuances and approaches it took to transition this to a virtual environment. And I apologize in advance because now I hear there's construction on the road, so you will truly get an urban experience with this talk. And I want to start off our conversation today by acknowledging the Indigenous communities from the place that I'm going to be talking about in Boston Harbor and extending up to our host in the Harris Center. So from the harbor, we have the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Wampanoag peoples, and extending up to you all, the Pennacook and Abenaki peoples. As an Indigenous woman, I grew up on the island of Maui until I left for university, and the way in which I was raised and how I approach not only this presentation, but the development of this course and my own education involves honoring the Indigenous peoples in the places that we get the opportunity to explore and understand. And it's my hope that this presentation can help plant seeds for all of us to reflect on how we can go about not only interacting and honoring the Indigenous peoples and the original caretakers and storytellers of this place, but we can be advocates for their perspectives, ideas, and stories and the work that we're all involved in. So here's an overall outline of what I'll be going through today, and a question that I pose to my students and that we'll take some time to reflect on here is, what does Boston Harbor mean to you? And the activities and functions in which I use to unpack that question falls under the field of place-based learning. So I'll make some time to talk about what this field is and what are the threads in which I pulled on to develop this course. And another component is how this type of field changes in our new virtual reality here, and leaving you with a few concluding thoughts and takeaways. So to address this initial question of what does Boston Harbor mean to you, I figured we should start off with the map. So you can see here is the Boston area. You can see these outlines of Boston Harbor Islands. We have Massachusetts Bay, and it would extend right into the Atlantic Ocean. And if we were to go to up northwest to New Hampshire, the Harris Center. And where the University of Massachusetts Boston is located is at this black star. And what makes the location of the university so special is that it's truly on water's edge, as you can see in this photo here. You can see parts of the island and the water, and it's a really beautiful vista that the students get to experience. And another special part about how this university is set is that the public transportation and parking lots are more inland. So what ends up happening is that the students catch shuttles to this part of the university, and they ride along this coastal road. They ride along this coastal road here, and their shuttle drops them off right in front here. So every day they come into campus, they leave campus, and this is what they see. So if this was our first day of class, what I would say is to close your eyes and think about their first memory of Boston Harbor. And I would give them a moment to do so. Take a moment yourselves to do the same. And it's once you grasp onto that initial memory, I would say, all right, open your eyes and paint that memory. And I would have an array of materials in which to do that. And even though the materials aren't exactly present in front of us, we can still think about these memories. So maybe you are from New England and you might not have spent too much time in Boston, but you're familiar with this view, which is landing in to the Boston Logan Airport. You can see the skyline on your right here. There would be specks of the Boston Harbor Island on your left. All of this is contingent on if you have a window. But the feelings, right, that might get evoked as you're landing in this place is, yes, I get to stretch my legs, I get to walk around, or it's looking at your clock and being like, I just missed my connection. That makes me very anxious and nervous. So you can start to see that there are particular feelings that we start to associate with place. And maybe you're not from the Boston area and you've never had to make a connection, and this might not be at all relatable to you. So you might have dug a little deeper on your experience with the US history. And you can see here that a representation of the Boston Tea Party. And if you asked me about 10 years ago, if what my first memory of Boston Harbor would be, I would probably tie it back to this. And I don't necessarily have a lot of feelings or emotions associated with the US history textbooks. And what I'm trying to show is that there's two different representations, right? And there are varying degrees to which we start to gain memories and emotions of place. So I taught this class a year ago for the first time. It was the pilot. And I asked my students the same question. They're primarily from the Boston area, and a majority of the paintings I got were of this. This is a National Grid tank with these beautiful swashes of color. It's an art exhibition known as the Rainbow Swash, which was done in 1971. And if you were driving south on I-93 into Boston, you would see this essentially art exhibition on the horizon. So if you turn it more to the right, you would see these beautiful swashes of color. Maybe not the sky is this as pretty as this here, but it is quite distinctive. And it was done by this woman named Karita Kent, outlined here. And she has a very fascinating history as an artist, educator, and advocate for social justice. There is a number of art experts that can do justice to telling her story. So I'll just provide some brief points to talk about this exhibition. So this is Karita Kent. At 18, she entered the religious order Immaculate Heart of Mary. She began doing art, teaching in an art department, and her work would incorporate religious and biblical symbols, and would also pull on modern day or media at the time, including advertising images and slogans, even popular song lyrics. And as her work progressed, it became increasingly political. It urged viewers to consider poverty, racism, and injustice as they engaged with her art. And I could say so much more about her. But what ended up happening was that she ended up leaving the order in 1968, moved to the Boston area, and started taking on these public and private commissions. So this is a really wonderful story, but when I asked my students why this tank, I did not hear anything about Karita Kent or the history behind it, or even an artistic representation. One of my students most clearly made me think about this relation to emotion and space in itself. And they said that whenever they saw the tank on the horizon, it made them feel really good because they knew they were close to home. And in that moment, it taught me really two things. When we're asking students, or in my particular case, I was asking students to tap into a memory of a place. They tapped into this essential emotion of belonging and community. And it also, on the flip side, I'm a marine scientist, and I'm so tempted to show them what's beyond the seaside. There are 34 different islands, each with its own interesting scientific, ecological, and historical context. However, it made me pull back and be like, all right, I need to make sure that I'm incorporating all of these elements, from the urban parts to the scientific islands to the local communities, into this curriculum. So one of the ways I do that is by coming back to the question of, what does Boston Harbor mean to you? And I'll talk more in detail about how I went about parsing out this curriculum. However, approaching this question and understanding that's an evolving approach to understanding a meaning and association with place, it not only helps the students find where they might have an affinity to a particular community or place, but I think what's really important is when they're able to identify that they don't have a particular connection, but they know that other communities do, because it really helps shape the next generation of environmental leaders and stewards to be able to recognize when they need to advocate and support for communities that are different from them or that they might not immediately identify with. So this leads me to the next part of our conversation about how do we actually go about approaching these questions and using the field of place-based education to do that. So in this next part, I want to take some time to talk about this field and what are the components in which I pulled at. However, I do want to preface that I'm not a place-based researcher or expert. There's very much of a rich body of literature surrounding this, and it is so unique for the varying places in which you develop these types of curriculum. But I will more or less walk you through how I walk through understanding this field and what I decided to incorporate into my own classroom. So I want to start off with a really rich definition of this course, and I'm going to underscore some components that really resonated with me. So here is from Charles Elfer's 2011 dissertation. So it's reported that place-based education, or PBE, is a contemporary educational term, which refers to those forms of pedagogy that seek to connect learning to the local, ecological, cultural, and historical context in which schooling itself takes place. I'm going to highlight a few of those to outline what I was learning from this field as I was starting to put together the course. So one of those highlights is this contemporary educational term. It said that our modern understanding of place-based education came out of a collaboration between John Elder, Middlebury College in Vermont, Lori Lane Zucker, and the Orion Society, which is an environmental organization dedicated to interdisciplinary environmental education models. So this happened in 1992. And then highlight is definitely on contemporary because there are many examples before 1992 where educators, philosophers, thinkers were relying on things that were in the environment to help in the classroom and to teach certain concepts, even extending back to Aristotle. There are examples of this. Next is the forms of pedagogy, the plural. For me, really jumped out because if you're looking at the landscape on the back here, you can see that when it comes to thinking about this place, there's this urban social dynamic that needs to be pulled in. So it needs to rely on a number of disciplines if we're going to help introduce these students to this urban harbor here. The next part is the local context. And when we tailored this course to this particular first year audience, it was important to think about local context because a university setting, a number of students are not only coming in from the Massachusetts area, but also internationally. So this type of seminar can serve as a way to not only introduce them to the university, but to the local community itself. And lastly, I want to note this last edition, which was really important. It's in which schooling itself takes place, and the school is right on the harbor. It's something that they can really take advantage of, really teaching out with what's happening in the environment. And another thing is that many introductory courses are looking to sharpen certain skills in the classroom, and to know that there are skills in a place-based course that you can sharpen literally right outside. That's absolutely incredible. So just to drill into that a little more, I pulled out a quote from David Orr's Ecological Literacy and from 1992, and it says that the study of place involves complementary dimensions of intellect, from direct observation, investigation, experimentation, and skill in the application of knowledge. And if you are an educator, K through 12, informal opportunities, university, ears are probably ringing because there are certain parts of your curriculum that you're hoping to help your students develop these types of skills or to finesse them. And for me, I was just like, I want to help instructors that are working with these students to give them opportunities to practice the development of these skills in the place they're going to school. So I really like this piece by David Orr. The next part I really like this from Smith 2002, where it says there's an emphasis on learning experiences that allow students to become the creators of knowledge rather than the consumers of knowledge created by others. And this is even another first year mindset switch where the students are coming to university, consume all this knowledge, go off and get their degrees, transition to their next phase of life. However, in the university setting is when they start to piece knowledge together for themselves and what are the things they want to carry on into their next school year, career, whatever it may be. And one of the best ways to introduce them to this concept is actually learning from the creators of knowledge within the space, whether it's the Indigenous people or the local communities, immigrant communities around, talking to how they went about creating knowledge to thrive and in some cases survive in this system. And lastly, I want to point to Grunwald's 2003 work, which links critical theory or the identification of social inequities and inequalities. So that body of work with place-based pedagogy. And what it said here is that it foregrounds this narrative of local and regional politics that is attuned to the particularities of where people live, and it connects global trends and how it impacts the local places. And Grunwald's work is absolutely undeniable in the place that I'm based in. I mean, you see the city skyline. There are lots of peoples, it being a very global, mixed community. And these are concepts that I need to introduce students to be able to hold on to these complicated matters. So these are more or less of the components that I relied on putting together this type of course. And here's just a step back of coming down to really focusing on skill building that's complementary to other courses, concept of knowledge creation, and these local to global developments with people as well. However, there's another arm of this work that really required me to reflect as an instructor. And it's from Claudia Rudenberg's work in 2005. This quote is very powerful to me, is that all people bear marks of the place where they have lived, no matter how long or short a time they have lived there. And for me, this was more I think the literature more points to, and no matter how long the student is there will be some type of impact on them. But also as someone that is putting together these communities and experiences to introduce them to this place, I had to have a really fundamental understanding of what are the things that I individually introduce, and whether it's biases or unique perspectives, I need to be very aware of what that contribution is. So as I was saying earlier, I grew up Native Hawaiian, grew up on the island of Maui. Before I left for university, I don't think I even like fully comprehended the concept of leaving Hawaii until I got to the final stages of my high school phase. And one of the things I learned about was this concept of the Aqua System, which is a land tract system that ancient Hawaiians used. So I want to briefly talk about that. So this is more of a formal definition of an ahupua'a, narrow wedge-shaped land sections that ran from the mountains to the sea. Here's an artistic representation of it. And I remember growing up with this poster on the wall of almost a majority of my classes I was in. And what this is meant to show was that in a current understanding of land ownership, they kind of look like puzzle pieces from space. But when it comes to the puzzle pieces of land tracts in Hawaii back then, they all ran from the mountains to the sea. And it was with the understanding that things on land would naturally impact what's happening on the sea and vice versa. I think an easier way to see this is if I show you an image in which I grew up thinking about and looking at. So this is an image I took in 2017 when I was actually home for some field work. This is on the south coast of Maui. And you see there's this really beautiful mountain area. There's a road back here along the coast. That's where I don't know if you can't see very well, but there's like a type of metal fencing that keeps the rocks up. There's this road, there's this beach, there's this piece of beach that I used to play at as a kid on the weekends. And this expanse of water here is quite unique in that it's known as the Reef system. It was designated as a hope spot by the Sylvia Earle Foundation in, I believe in 2017, same year I was here. And it's so special because it is home to the oldest corals in the main Hawaiian Islands, and it is also home to the largest known manta ray population in the United States. So I grew up with like this. It's a normal view. I saw a mountain and I saw the sea, and because of that, it was very simple to me to understand that things that were happening up here could impact what was going on with corals and vice versa. So if there's a large rainstorm, we know that debris might impact what was happening over the reefs. And if there was some type of large weather event or tide, it could come up and encroach on the road or the beach and might contribute to erosion on the cliff. So this is more or less how I grew up. I had this a really fundamental understanding that there were these interchanges between land and sea. However, when it came to thinking about the Boston skyline and water, I remember thinking how useful it was to understand that there was a continuum of relationships between the mountains and the sea, and what would be a way in which I could help cement that there are these continuing connections, and it takes multiple communities to address these larger environmental problems we're looking at, especially in urban areas. And the manner in which I approached it was making sure there was time in the syllabus to meet with people from the skyscrapers to the sea. So what that looked like was making time in my syllabus to meet with Indigenous peoples who were these original storytellers of this place, the urban planners that are talking to communities and thinking about what goes into building along a coastline and what are the tensions at play. In addition, interacting with scientists. And obviously that's more of my bias, but I think it was really an important part for me to introduce different types of scientists. Like I do remote sensing, and it was more fun to have them talk to somebody that plays in the mud or is looking at kelp forests. In addition, there are a number of nonprofits that go out and do volunteer work. So we make time in the syllabus for that. Government, my students have in the past semester wrote letters to their legislator on bills related to what was going on in the harbor. And for me, most importantly, was putting in this node for interacting with students that are just a little ahead of you, because all of these communities can do a fantastic job at talking about what are the larger problems and how they got there. But sometimes students want to hear essentially like their older brothers and sisters telling them about how they went about making decisions to pursue maybe a career in urban planning or in science. Another thing that I really value is hearing stories and getting a window of insight into, well, number one is how people went about even thinking to pursue a career along a coastline. But I think too, it's this concept of, you want to hear a lot of different perspectives. And one of the essays I now start to teach with, or books I start to teach this with, is All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, which is brilliantly edited by Ayanna Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. And there are a number of ways that people are using this type of text in their classrooms, but one of the ways that I found most useful is that students can get some insight into what it means to do environmental policy, law, science, advocacy. So there are these really short essays where they can really put themselves in the mindset of that. But there's also this really added bonus of students hearing from leaders at the frontiers of the climate movement. They're from different walks of life. And I think that's important for them to start to recognize what are the shared characteristics and traits that could also make them into an environmental leader that they want to be. So I very much valued this book in the way I went about teaching my course. However, I don't know if you're keeping track of timelines, is that So we initially started developing this course maybe almost 3 years ago. Pandemic time, apologies if that was wrong. I'll fix it in the YouTube comments later. But we started developing this course and we taught a pilot of it a year ago, which means I had all of these grand ideas for place-based education. We're about to tweak and finesse them. And then the pandemic happened. And I had to think of, how do we gather this sense of place in a virtual environment when all of us are like this on this call? And I think, fortunately, there are a number of things I was able to rely on as a remote health sensing scientist. But for any of you teachers on the call, I know what it was like to feel heavy, knowing that there are a number of barriers to being able to teach, one, and to help your students in these trying times. So I'm going to talk through some activities that I tried to make as interactive as possible, and you should feel free to reach out if you're curious about ways to do so. But let me just walk through a few of them. So here is something I do in person, and something the Harris Center is really great resources for nature journaling. I call them field journals. And what we would do in person is we would go and sit in different buildings in the spring when it was cold and look out, and I would tell them to describe the weather, what they were seeing. And a lot of times what I was getting them to do was saying, like, if you didn't have your phone or you didn't have access to the internet, how would you go about seeing where the tide stage is at? And pretty quickly they started to gather that you can just look at how wet the rocks are and see where the aquatic vegetation is coming up to get a sign of where the tide is at. The next thing, you would look at the leaves, see when they start budding, look at the anatomy of the plant during the winter to further understand how does beautiful vegetation even come about. And lastly, you would look to the sky, see what's happening with the weather, the clouds, where the sun is rising. What does that tell us about where we are located on the planet? So all of these things I wanted to keep. But when we transitioned into the pandemic, I initially was like, let's watch some live cams of the harbor. And it wasn't as interactive. I felt we were just watching boats pass by because it's a very busy area. So that's when I tapped into, all right, I know how to use satellite data, and maybe there's a way that we can show them these bird's eye views of different environmental measurements, and that can help us out. So one of the things I did was use Windy. It's an application that you can start making different data layers to look at temperature, wind, a number of other factors. And also it became this, I was just experimenting and trying. But one of the things I started to piece together as the students started to poke at this was that I can actually start to connect them wherever they're based at their home to what's going on with their classmates and what's going on in the harbor. So I would ask questions like, what's the water temperature, the sea surface temperature in the harbor based off of these windy maps? What is the air temperature where you're at? And they would have conversations about like, oh, I don't think this is representative of where I'm based at in Western Mass. I also have students that are not in Boston at the moment. I have one in the Midwest, I have one in Texas. So what we would do is I made time to talk about what happened to that Arctic air that came down into the United States. And a really clever add-on to Windy is that you can change the altitude, and we started to look at the jet stream. We could start to use these really, really fun maps that are available to start asking scientific questions and making observations in the environment. And also there are a number of maps that you can do from forest or fire intensity, thunderstorms, precipitation, wind. So many different things that you could do, and you could really tweak for the questions and skills you're hoping to build with your students. The next thing that our class does, and interestingly, we have the support of the library here, is that my students do archive research, and the intention of having them locate primary sources was so that they got to know what was available at the library for them to use, and that they have a comfort with the research librarians that were there. So one of the initial assignments was to use primary sources to tell a story about an event on the Boston Harbor Islands. And what I was, one of the great parts about like actually being able to go into archives is the feeling, that the sensory experience of going into these archives. However, we had to turn over to digital archives. And I actually came to really appreciate the accessibility to this, because for some of my students, they didn't have the time to go about digging and mucking around through the archive. So I'm going to share a short story that one of my students pulled up through his digital archive work. This is of Fort Andrew, which is on Pedix Island, which was a prisoner of war camp for Italians in 1940s. So here is the Boston Harbor itself, Boston Harbor Islands, and Fort Andrew is located here. And one of the things he was interested in was that there was about 1,000 POWs that were there after the Mussolini surrendered North Africa at the time, or 1943. And a lot of the reports at the time was saying that these POWs were greeting so well under the Geneva Convention because they were actually given a salary. There's more liberty to move around the base. In addition, the fencing was really low. Also, there's this interesting note about they could have a chaperone take them into Boston. So what my student did was I started to look through old photos to see if you could you see that in how the photographs were capturing this particular sentiment. And I really enjoyed the student's presentation, because he made us look at, do these prisoners of war look happy, and what does that mean? Or is it the photographer trying to capture a certain sentiment? So it's a really fantastic way for my students to be comfortable, not only with the research librarian at my university, but also the larger archives that are available online. The next part of that was that they had to do a class presentation. So I told them, you could do a normal PowerPoint presentation, that's completely fine, but I'll also give you the opportunity to use some of the more interactive tour building tools that are available. And one of them being from Google Earth Engine. And one of my students said I could show her story in our chat today. So let me see if this works. Oops, no. All right, here it is. So this is Google Earth, and she used it to build a story about Spectacle Island. So if I zoom out a bit, you can see the Boston Harbor Island State Park. And when we zoom into here, what she is showing is that what in the blue, she made this outline to show that that's what the Spectacle Island at the time looked like. There wasn't this piece of land here. And she goes on to tell this story about what went into building this land. So I'll briefly walk you through this. So, and you can also make these really clever notes on the side. She talks about what went into that. In the red, she outlines where it was filled in with debris, which was a mix of having to do with putting debris from the Big Dig tunnel under Boston into this area. But in addition, talked about how much the city went into trying to make this look like a normal island. And last, oh yeah, I forgot about this part. You can make these really clever slides in here as well. And she wanted to show what went into layering contaminants from the debris that was carried over to Spectacle Island. And included this outline here in the yellow of what it looks like today. And that was the last part that was added. The next thing she wanted to note was that on the protected side, not on the Atlantic Ocean, you see that it was intentionally created as a beach to mimic what was happening on the other islands that didn't have as much intervention. And on this side, you're just putting on a note about that you see a seawall here, which is used as protection for the larger weather systems that come into the Atlantic Ocean. I'm gonna have to be a little patient on this one because this actually, there's a few islands at which you can actually have that Google map experience of walking around the island. And she's noting here that to keep this aesthetic of as natural as possible, you don't see any paved roads and you can walk along here, the same function of, I'm sure there was a huge lag on that. So at your leisure, you can feel free to actually look at Google Earth and you can walk around these islands as well. And actually, she ends on how this park ended up opening up as a tourist location and shares some parting thoughts about this mixture of using a Boston Harbor island for city purposes, for essentially exploitation before, and then now it's turning into this tourist attraction. And one of the reasons, well, not one of the reasons, I didn't know what to initially think when it came to offering this option, but I felt that it helped the students become way more connected with this place when they can poke around in Google Earth and make their little points and walk around the island when they can't do that at this point. So I want to transition over into a few concluding thoughts and takeaways to make time for questions, and just bringing you back to the front of the building where the shuttle would pick you up to take you to your cars or your public transportation, and just to leave you with the sense of this is what the students walk in to school every day seeing and leaving. And I've had the privilege of having you on this virtual space, and as you're parting, coming back to this question of what does Boston Harbor mean to you? Maybe it didn't mean much before, maybe it still doesn't, but I hope that similar to my students, you were able to see that there are communities that have a particular affinity for this space and have deep connections as well. In addition, I talked about how there are core components of place-based education that can be really helpful in the university setting, from skill building to knowledge creation, assessing local to global people impacts, and also that these things can still be polished and refined and actually developed in a virtual setting. So that is from skill building when it comes to looking at observations on windy to Google Earth, where you can make more observations. And in my students' case, created a resource for other people to go and explore Spectacle Island, which we had the brief pleasure of doing today. And lastly, this local to global context. And I want to I'm ending on this because there are so many parts of the archives that can actually you might not have time to physically do in person, but online in the comforts of your home, where there aren't as many logistical concerns, students had the opportunity to go about and discover those things. And I think it was so important for them to make connections with local impacts on these islands to these larger global events. So if I was to kind of put all of this into a pie, I think the two things I added on and further developing, as any educator knows, you're constantly learning from your students and learning about yourself in the process of this, especially when it comes to place. But I think the two things that I'm really focusing on these days is this concept of using innovative tech to create these more meaningful interactive experiences. And the sense of belonging was already so important when it came to thinking about the university setting and introduction to the area, but it's so much more important now when they're all virtual. And hopefully pursuing these types of endeavors can help us better connect students with their education and help them see themselves as the next generation of environmental leaders and stewards. So I do want to take a quick moment to thank a bunch of people. So it might not be that quick. I first want to thank Dean Rajani, and she's really the master architect when it came to how do we use our very special location on the University of Massachusetts-Boston to enhance students' experiences. And she wrote a grant that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities that helped with the development of this course. It would not be possible with, this whole thing would not be possible without Dean Rajani. I'm so grateful. I want to thank the Harris Center for giving me this opportunity. For instructors out there, it's been, we've just been running and trying to keep up with these times, but putting together this talk gave me an opportunity to reflect on how much has grown and evolved. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank the Boston Harbor Islands and National State Park. They've been such a great support system. Obviously, the University of Massachusetts-Boston, just for being located where it's at and providing the support to create these types of experiences for students. And lastly, I think the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, Mathematics Ford Fellowship. When I was awarded a Ford Fellowship a few years ago, one of the initial pushes they had for me was to think about what was my role as a Native Hawaiian scientist in the educational space. And it was that initial push that inspired me to reach out to Dean Rajani to figure out how I could be involved. And this is really what ended up blossoming out of it. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I think I should stop sharing probably.
Thank you, Kelly. We thank you for that and some of those really fascinating glimpses, virtual glimpses of the harbor. We do have questions, some of which are kind of on the teaching end of things and some of which are about the landscape. So one question from Karen is about those islands. You talked about your student research on POWs living on one of those islands, which was new and surprising to me. She's wondering a bit about inhabitation of those islands in general. Were they originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples? Are there people who live on any of them now?
Very good question. And so there are about 34 different islands. And from what I've come to understand is that there are certain islands where their Indigenous communities have a deeper connection with. So one of the examples I showed for Spectacle Island, at least, was that it was actually a very specific type of dumping ground for some of the Indigenous activities and communities there. I don't necessarily know what dumping ground means in that sense, because I think in present day, I'm like, oh, that's not a good thing. But I think there are some symbolism around that that I myself need to learn more about. And across history, interestingly, there's a really rich history. A Spectacle Island was once a glue factory. There was a casino there. It got shut down by the Boston Harbor Island, or the Boston City. For the POWs on Pedix Island, there were actually private citizens living on the island, and the accounts that came from these POWs being very kind was from them, because there is I think her name is Matilda. She wrote this account where when she was a child, she would be picking blackberries around the island, and she would run into the prisoners of war at the time, and she didn't exactly see them as a threat. She was just like, oh, they all live here too. So very rich history.
Kind of a related question is, how many of these islands have been there all along and were naturally formed, versus you talked about kind of how that one island was expanded through fill, which is a kind way of explaining what they put in the ground probably to create that island. But do you have any sense for how many are naturally formed versus created by people?
So a majority of the islands are actually these interesting geological features called drumlins, which is the result of the glaciers in the past ended up pulling back. Logan will probably speak to this better because she's a paleo climate person. But as those glaciers pulled back, there was rocks that would get stuck, and they would pull sediment, and it would create these mounds, more or less. And it's actually only place on a coastline in the United States where that exists. So a few of them ended up getting filled by the city for a number of reasons. But a majority of like those initial mounds were there by geological forces.
I have another follow-up question from Kathleen, who asked if are there any buildings from the Italian prisoner camp left on the island, or what buildings are there?
So there are, I know that there are structures that exist, and there are a number of groups that actually wanted to make sure that they are conserved throughout history. There's, let me think. So for Fort Andrews, I know that, I'm not sure how many of the original POW structures themselves exist, but there are a number of other constructions that if you can still go to this island, you can see them. I believe there's like a hospital, you can see an artillery unit, all of these things. The same with Fort Warren, where they kept the Confederacy prisoners there. And a lot of that is, a lot of effort was put into keeping that intact as well.
One question I had is about kind of natural history. And, you know, I think people think of Boston Harbor as a place where there's not a lot of nature. And the pictures you shared show that that's really not true, that there's actually quite a bit of open space. So I'm just wondering, like, what's like one thing that you think most people about the natural history of Boston Harbor or the Harbor Islands that would surprise people? Is there something that comes to mind as you know, that would shock people to know that about the natural world in Boston Harbor?
Yeah, I think one of the things when I first moved there, I grew up in Hawaii, and I've seen very clean beaches and harbor spaces in my life. So when I moved to a city, I didn't think that would be the same. But then when I moved there are beaches. There's a lot of work has put into making this aquatic space, one that people can recreationally enjoy. So actually, a really fun fact about the University of Massachusetts Boston is that there is a free sailing program for them. So they can learn how to sail and take out boats. You can stand up paddle, you can kayak. And even for the students that I encountered, they're just like, I didn't even think you could like go out there. So maybe not exactly a landscape, but I think being able to experience an aquatic landscape is something that's a big surprise to a lot of people, and pretty easy actually to access as well.
That's a great transition into our next, and I think probably our last question, which is from Karen Seaver, who's Harris Center staff ecologist and also a faculty member at Keene State and teaching students in environmental studies and related disciplines. She says, do you have any tips for connecting students or just people in general with aquatic environments specifically to avoid that reverse fish out of water feeling for us, since we're such terrestrial beings?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think kind of pulling into like my Indigenous background, one of the things that became very apparent when I moved to the United States was that aquatic space was not really seen as land, or like it could be something that like overflows, you know, into these types of ecological connections. So one of the things I try to push my students to do in the classroom is to not think about where the seaside ends, but to actually think of those connections I was bringing up earlier, because I think it broadens their understanding that all of these things are connected and have impacts. And especially when it comes to talking about topics of climate change and sea level rise and a number of other things, I think introducing students to those concepts can be really important, and just in the seeds that you plant early. But I know for where you're at the Harris Center, I saw a beautiful photo of a river and all of these things.
We have a lot of lakes and ponds and rivers and streams, but lakes and ponds are the big aquatic communities out here.
Yeah, so kind of helping, I think it's a little easier to see when you see water constrained by land, like getting to think about how all of those things can be connected. I understand it's a little difficult, but that's kind of one of the problems I face on the aquatic side is that things don't stop at the seaside. If anything, things that could be really informed by it.
Right, that idea of the mountain leading to the sea that you talked about earlier, it's not the end of the land, it's a connection point
Mhm.
too. Well, I think we've reached 1 o'clock. So thank you, Kelly, so much for sharing sharing your teaching with us, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad to see that there were so many educators here. So this was really, I think, well suited for them, and we really appreciate your time. And hopefully everyone else, we will see you next Wednesday for Logan Brenner, or Thursday night for learning more about Abbott Thayer. And thank you all, and until next time, and thank you, Kelly, very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.